Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to speak here today. This is a leadership conference, and I know that you were invited here because you're all in leadership positions. And you know, being in a leadership position, it's not easy. It's very difficult to make hard choices that you must face. It's very difficult to meet rising demands, and it's very difficult to keep your team motivated, let alone flourishing. So it's something that's a tough thing for us to do. Great leaders have the ability really to do all these things. Great leaders have the ability to really get people to do things that they never thought was possible on their own. You inspire them to do those type of things. Great leaders do this by creating a vision and instilling every team member with hope. Today I'm going to tell you a story about a great leader. I don't know if you've heard of this man, but you will today. It's a great leader. It's a story of a man who inspired 27 of his team members to endure against unbelievable conditions and absolutely astronomical odds. It's a story of Ernest Shackleton, Sir Ernest Shackleton, sorry Andrew, Sir Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance. I hope when you hear this story, it will inspire you to become a great leader yourself. Let me set the stage. In August of 1916, 22 men were stranded on an uninhabited island known as Elephant Island, 400 miles from the South Pole. No one in the world knew where they were except for their leader, Ernest Shackleton, who 4 months earlier left in a small lifeboat to seek help. Battling severe weather conditions, it took everything these guys had to stay alive. I'm talking about they had barely enough food, with barely enough clothing to protect them, with barely enough shelter to protect them from the elements. They had the one thing, an abundance of one thing that kept them alive, and that one thing was hope. Because when you have hope, you could cope against anything. I mean, hope is more important than any physical attribute you could have, food, shelter, water, whatever it is. These men were nourished with hope because Ernest Shackleton told them when he left 4 months earlier, "I'll be back." And this guy always delivered. When he said something, he delivered. To find out how these guys got in this predicament in the first place, let me take you back 2 years earlier to the beginning of this mission. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton was an explorer running out of things to explore. Twice he tried to reach the South Pole, only to come up short, and he was beaten to the punch by a man named Ronald Amundsen in 1912. Because of this, in 1914, he wanted to create a vision that was grandiose, much greater than just going to the pole, the center of the pole and back. His vision was to cross the entire Antarctic continent. For this daring mission, he needed a crew that was capable and would rise to the task. Shackleton needed a crew that was strong both physically as well as mentally because of the things they would endure. He put an ad in the paper, he posted an ad, and the ad basically read, "Men wanted for a hazardous mission, cold conditions, low pay, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in the event we do get back." If you look at this ad, this is an ad that appealed to an adventurous man's soul. This ad was honest, this ad was frank, this ad was audacious. Really what this ad did is it laid down a challenge. And everyone in this room knows what a challenge will do for you. When you get a challenge, it forces you to leave your comfort zone. It forces you to think, hey, can I do this? Because you've never done that before. That's why we love challenges, because it forces us to do things we never thought. But the thing is, if you accept the challenge, you accept it because you believe you can do it. 5,000 men thought they could do it. They actually applied to this ad. Shackleton actually interviewed hundreds of men. Now, let me tell you something unique about his interview process. No interview lasted more than 5 minutes. He thought that within 5 minutes he could read a man well enough to know if they were capable of this duty or not. To do that, you have to rely on two things a lot of people don't rely on: instinct and intuition. That inner voice from inside that a lot of times we discount and we ignore. I mean, that's a powerful force, and he uses it well. He listened to his voice within, and he assembled a 27-man crew who had the character and the moxie to pull off this mission that he had in mind. After the crew was assembled, his next task was to secure a ship. He secured a sturdy wooden vessel, and he named it the Endurance. He named it the Endurance after his family motto, which was, "By endurance, we conquer." He also anticipated a lot of hardships in front, so that's why he named it the Endurance. Let me tell you one thing about endurance. He knew this all too well. When there's endurance, there's assurance. When you have endurance, there's an assurance that you're always going to give it your all. When you have endurance, there's an assurance that you're never going to give up. And when you have endurance, there's an assurance that you're going to try everything possible. Everything possible. Before they left, he laid down his vision. We talk about vision all the time. His vision was they were going to cross the Antarctic continent, and every single man was going to survive. Previous polar expeditions were littered with death. He said, we're going to all make it back. Really, when you have a vision, here's a question you should ask yourself. You should ask every single person you're giving that vision to, do you see what I see? Because when you have a vision, it's a picture in your mind. And a good leader can actually fax that picture in his mind into everybody else's mind. If you have that same picture, you're going to succeed. Do you see what I see? It's a picture of victory. He'd always ask that question, do you see what I see? August 1st, 1914, they left England on their journey. After 4 months, they reached their final port of call, which is the last time they docked, in an area called South Georgia Island. It was a remote fishing island close to the Antarctic Circle. It was actually the gateway to the Antarctic, and it was the southernmost host of human life. After leaving South Georgia, after resupplying, they made great progress. Actually, 4 weeks later, they were only 80 miles from their destination when they encountered ice. And ice was their arch enemy. And I'm talking when they encountered ice, it was from all over the place. Within 24 hours, the temperature dropped so drastically that they were frozen, and you can see a couple pictures, those are live footage, by the way, of what they were trying to do. For the next 7 days, Shackleton urged them on to try to break free from that ice. They tried everything. They tried sawing, they tried ramming the ice. It was to no avail. Let me tell you what happened at this point. The crew was in trouble. You got 27 guys loaded for bear, excited. They were 80 miles away from their destination. They were ready to cross the Antarctic continent. Now they're stuck in ice. And when I mean stuck in ice, Shackleton knew that because it was so late in the season, they would probably have to winter there all season. Now, in times of trouble as a leader, inevitably, if you're a father, mother, anytime there's trouble, like you get a flat tire in the car, the whole family looks to you because you're the driver. They always look to you as a leader. When there's trouble, people will look to you. They look to you, and every time they do, you must come through. When they look to you, you must come through. Shackleton came through when they were stuck in that ice by being supremely confident. He showed no disappointment, because if he showed disappointment, that would just transfer over to everybody else. And the other thing he did is remain calm and poised. He was poised at all times. He had that character about him. Now, if you know anything about the Antarctic winter, you have to battle two things. Number one is cold. And when I say cold, I'm talking frigid cold. Think about the coldest day in Chicago. Think about the coldest day in Buffalo, and imagine that it's like that constantly. That's actually a good day in the Antarctic. So they had to endure the cold. Now, fortunately for them, they had the ship, which would insulate them from the cold. But the other thing, which was worse, and Shackleton knew this because he was kind of a psychologist, he knew that the darkness, in the Arctic winter, you get about 4 months of darkness. That leads to depression, it leads to low morale, and when there's low morale and depression, bad things happen. Shackleton's main concern was to keep morale high. He did everything possible because he knew deep in his heart the mission was probably over. When the ice did thaw, they'd probably have to go back to England, so the morale was a little bit low. To keep morale high, he kept men on a strict routine. He gave them a sense of purpose. He made them do everything each day. He treated people equally as well. They had Cambridge-educated scientists scrubbing floors with regular seamen, and that gave the message that everybody's in this together, we're all going to work together, and that kind of stuff leads morale to be high. They did other things like shave their heads, and he always showed concern for the crew's welfare. He always, on somebody's birthday or any chance to celebrate a special occasion, he made sure he did. After 9 months on the ice, the crew was getting excited because after 9 months, the weather was starting to get warm. It was springtime, and Shackleton did a great job of keeping his crew intact. Now, when spring arrived, everybody on the crew was excited because they thought the ice was going to break apart this way. Unfortunately for them, the opposite happened. The ice started to get closer and closer to the Endurance. The pressure was absolutely mounting. Shackleton saw that that ship couldn't hold out much longer, so he gave the order to abandon ship. He said, guys, get off all the supplies we have. They had 3 lifeboats. He said, get those 3 lifeboats off there. 2 days after he gave the abandoned ship order, the ship was like a walnut in a vice, and it simply crushed. Now, let me put this in perspective. It's 1914. These guys have no cell phones, where they can't just get on a cell phone and say, hey guys, will you pick us up? Where you at? Oh, I'm at 36 North, 52 East, right? That's not going to happen. They had no cell phones, they had no airplanes. Wilbur and Orville Wright, they invented the airplane, but I don't think they went that far south back then. And actually, there was no satellites or anything else. They were basically on their own. Now, you could imagine the fear. You could imagine the urgency that these guys had. They have no ride home. They're on an iceberg, a raft of ice, and they're looking to Shackleton for guidance. Once again, it's a whole new ballgame. He knew what he had to do. In time of trouble, what happens? If you're a leader, they look to you and you must come through. Here's how Shackleton came through. He knew it was his moment of truth. He gave his crew guidance. He gave his crew vision. Without skipping a beat, he looked at all his guys and he said, guys, I know the ship's gone. Here is our new mission. We're going to get home alive. And I don't mean just one of us. I don't mean just two of us. I mean every single last one of us are getting home alive. He made sure that his guys knew his new vision. He made sure his guys knew that there was hope. He made sure his guys knew they were going to do it. Once again, he asked that question, do you see what I see? It's a picture of victory. Shackleton was a man. Let me tell you about this guy. He was fortunate in the respect that he could only see the positive. His greatest gift was optimism. He couldn't see the negative if he tried. He knew anything was possible if you do one thing, put mind over matter. And what I mean by that is, if you focus on negative, of course you're gonna think about those things and it'll deter you from your mission. If you only focus on the positive, positive results will happen. Mind over matter means, if you don't mind, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter to them that they lost their ship. They were gonna make it. It didn't matter to them that they were battling bitter cold because they were gonna make it. It didn't matter to them that they were low on food because they were gonna make it. Confined to the ice at this point, Shackleton had an initial plan. His initial plan was to take his men, and if you see the picture there, to pull that ship to the edge of the ice. The only problem was that the edge of the ice was about 200 miles away, and after 2 days of hard pulling, they only covered 1.5 miles. Now, the other thing he did is, like I said, he knew that morale was necessary. So what he did is they were basically sleeping on sleeping bags. And they had a whole bunch of sleeping bags. They had a bunch of good ones and some brutal sleeping bags. They weren't even sleeping bags. It was like a thing that was barely keeping you warm. Shackleton did this. He had a raffle, a lottery, whatever you call it, where they draw lots. And Shackleton rigged that so him and his key officers got the bad sleeping bags and the men received the warm ones. Now, what does that do to his crew? It lets them know two things. Number one, it lets them know that Shackleton does not put anybody over himself. And the second thing it does is it makes them feel like everybody's equal. Nobody has preferential treatment. Relying on penguins and seals for food during this time, supplies grew scarce as the months passed. After 5 months, the food supply became critical. Penguins and seals started to migrate north, and Shackleton during this time, despite the fact that the food supply was critical, he held tight. He was inspiring. He said, guys, we're going to make it. No matter what happens, we're going to make it. Finally, 14 months after being stuck on the ice, their break came. During the 14 months they were on the ice, the floe actually carried them 600 miles to the north. If you see that picture, it kind of shows you that they moved northward. Now that was great because when they moved northward, the weather started heating up and the ice started to break apart, and it gave them the opportunity to launch their lifeboats. 28 men crammed into 3 small lifeboats, got them all in there. And his vision was this, to get to a small remote island 100 miles to the northwest. Now these guys were battling brutal cold. Have you ever gotten wet clothes before and then go outside? Or how about wet hair? You walk outside with your hair wet? Within 2 seconds, your hair is frigid. Imagine your clothes getting pelted all the time with water, and then it freezes. It's like you're wearing a suit of armor. You could barely move. These guys are rowing a boat like this, and their hands are exposed. Now, I don't know if you could comprehend this, but these guys are in there for 4 days. Shackleton's saying, guys, let's go, let's go, let's go. Now, the weather was bad. And you know how they used to read and find out where they were with the sextant? Well, the skies were overcast. It wasn't until 4 days where they got their first sextant reading. After 4 days, Shackleton took a reading. He had to turn to his guys and say, guys, we lost 30 miles. Now, here's one thing. He did it right away because the one thing he didn't do is withhold bad news. And the other thing he did is he mentally reassured his guys. His guys were close to death. 4 days without food, 4 days battling bitter cold. They were close to death. They were in trouble once again. Once a good leader, when there's trouble, they look to you and you must come through. Here's how Shackleton came through. He once again relied on instinct and intuition. He knew that if he followed the prevailing currents, there was an island a little bit to the east known as Elephant Island. He thought he could make it. He stopped, looked at his guys and said, guys, we're going to make it. All I want you to do is hang in there, and I promise you we're going to make it. Now, you got to think about this. How does this guy Shackleton, who's about 40 years old, endure this stuff? He knew he was a nuclear reactor, that people had to look to him, and any energy he had would be transferred to his crew. He got his energy because he knew he was responsible for all 27 lives. He took that responsibility seriously, and that's why he never once, remember I told you put mind over matter? He never once thought about him being hungry. He never once thought about him being cold. All he thought about were those 27 men in his charge that he was responsible for. What happened was 2 days later, he delivered on his promise. After 6 days at sea, they finally reached land. Like I said, he came through. It was the first time in 497 days that they were on land. First time after 9 months living on a ship and 5 months living on ice. Despite the fact that they were on land, if you see that picture, it wasn't safe. There was really no chance of rescue. It was a remote island. There was no food, no natural shelter on this island. Shackleton did his best. His plan was this. It was an unbelievable plan. His plan was to take the most seaworthy lifeboat and sail 800 miles to the east. I don't know if you heard that. How many miles? 800 miles to the east in a lifeboat to South Georgia Island. The first thing he did was he had to assemble a crew. He looked at his crew's aptitudes and he looked at his crew's attitudes. Now, aptitude, as you know, is do they have the ability to do this? Attitude is how are they going to do this? First thing he did is he looked at his best navigator and said, "You're in." He looked at his best leader, and he said, "I want you to stay here with the 22 other men in my stead while I'm gone and keep them encouraged." He took his best 3 deckhands, and then he took the one guy with the worst attitude, and he wanted him with him because he knew if he kept that one guy on Elephant Island, he would be like cancer, that negativity would spread, and he didn't want that. He wanted that guy close to him. Prior to his departure, he gave his vision. He said once again, "Do you see what I see? I'm going to South Georgia Island, 800 miles away. I'm going to get a ship, and I'm going to come back and rescue you guys. Do you see what I see? It's a picture of victory." Made sure everybody was clear on that. He said this, "I'll be back, never give up. When you get hungry, remember, I'll be back, never give up. When you get cold, remember, I'll be back, never give up. When there's a doubt in your mind, I want you to remember, I'll be back, never give up, because I can promise you one thing, I will never give up. And I promise you I'll be back." They had such faith in this guy, they believed him. And just like hope, they were instilled with hope prior to making that departure. Battling angry seas, 15 to 20-foot waves, 50 to 70 mile-an-hour winds, Shackleton set sail for South Georgia Island. It wasn't until 3 days where he took his first navigational read. Once again, he had to rely on instinct and intuition to get him there. After 10 days, they ran out of water. Kept urging his crew on. "Come on, guys, we can make it, we can make it." Cold, hungry, the whole shot. After 16 days at sea, 16 days at sea, and I want to tell you, it was unbelievable conditions. I'm not even doing justice, but imagine how cold and hungry they felt. They finally saw South Georgia Island, but nature played a cruel trick. On the night where they could see South Georgia Island, a typhoon hit. They were thrown, and he's laughing, it's a true story. A typhoon hit. These guys were thrown around like rag dolls through the night. That ship was in danger of sinking. These guys did everything they could to bail out water, did everything possible, and lo and behold, they summoned every morsel of energy they had to keep that ship alive. The next morning, as daylight came, 6 barely alive men docked on South Georgia Island. Now, believe me, these guys were happy just to be on land. Just to be on land. Unfortunately, even though they were on the island, they were on the wrong side of the island because they had to get to the other side of the island, which is a whaling station. Let me put this in perspective. You guys remember yesterday when you were done with the Y? Remember how that guy was joking around? "We got a Y down the street," and you guys are dying. Like, "We got a Y down the street," and you're laughing. "Yeah, right, right." Well, that's tantamount to what this guy had. He just made the greatest, and this is documented as the greatest open sea journey of all time. He just finished that. Now he's got to cross uncharted land that consisted of 10,000-foot mountains, unbelievably deep crevices. He had no map, no idea how to get there. Let me tell you what he did. He let his crew, 2 other guys, rest for 2 days because he knew they needed the rest. He didn't. With only 50 feet of rope to climb, they took screws out of the boat and put it on the bottom of their shoes for traction. Despite the fact they were hungry, tired, and physically hurting, they crossed this island. Let me tell you something. After 18 hours of climbing, his 2 buddies were so physically exhausted, they looked to him and said, "We can't go on." He knew that they were at such a high altitude that if he didn't do something, they might die. He had to get them down. What he did is said, "All right, guys, you're tired? Go ahead and take a nap." He told them to take a nap. He waited for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, he woke his guys up and said, "Guys, you've been asleep for 2 hours. Let's move." Once again, with endurance, he's not a bad guy. He had to do it. But imagine him staying awake. Once again, with endurance, there's assurance. He assured these guys they were going to make it. After another 18 hours, after 36 hours total of climbing over these mountains, like I said, no map, relying on instinct and intuition, he finally got to the whaling station at Elephant Island. Now, to put this in perspective, 4 modern climbers tried the same climb as Shackleton did in 1997. They had modern tools, they had modern equipment, they were well rested, they had food, the whole 9. It took these guys 48 hours to cover the same distance as Shackleton did in 36. The difference was they had a map, they knew the exact route. He didn't have a map. I'll tell you the big difference. 2 things are the difference on this. Number 1 is motivation. Like I said, why we do things. They did it because they just wanted to have some fun. Can we do it? He did it because he knew 27 men, 22 men on Elephant Island, and the 3 other guys on the other side of the island were relying on him. He knew that burned inside, and that's what pushed him to forge ahead. Finally, from May to August, after he finally got to the whaling station, he secured a boat. From May to August, he tried making treks back to Elephant Island to rescue those guys still on there. Back at Elephant Island, despite being 12 weeks overdue, these guys never lost hope. Each day, as a matter of fact, they'd start the day off with, guys, pack your gear. This might be the day the boss will come. They were fueled by hope, and because they were fueled by hope, they endured. The greatest day of Ernest Shackleton's life was August 30th, 1916. That was the day he was able to return to Elephant Island to rescue those 22 men on the island. He already rescued the other 3. Now, it took him 4 tries, using 4 different boats and 4 months to get back to that island. All 27 men survived. All 27 men shared his vision. All 27 endured incredible circumstances. All 27 lives were a testament to his leadership. This was a story of vision. Do you see what I see? This was a story of instinct and intuition. Listen to the voice within. This was a story of energy and endurance. This was a story of the power of hope. This was a story of outstanding leadership.